At 9:34 this morning Pacific Time, inside the ornate presidential palace known as the National Palace in Mexico City, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a comprehensive trade and security agreement with the Pacific Alliance nations that fundamentally restructures North American economic relationships. Something happened in that signing ceremony that has never occurred in the 30-year history of NAFTA and its successor agreement. A sitting Mexican president formally prioritized trade integration with Chile, Peru, and Colombia over deference to United States economic pressure. This is not a routine diplomatic gathering. This is the moment when Mexico announced to the world that Donald Trump's tariff threats and immigration demands have pushed America's closest neighbor into the arms of a trading bloc that explicitly excludes the United States. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you, because what happened today in Mexico City is not just a trade story. It is a stress test on whether American economic dominance in the Western Hemisphere can survive when our own president treats allies like enemies and negotiations like hostage situations. If you care about what happens to American jobs, American exports, and American influence over the next 6 months, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the consequences of this signing will cascade through every sector of the American economy, and what I'm about to show you is why Trump's tariff strategy just collapsed in spectacular fashion. Here is what we know. According to 3 independent sources, 2 from the Mexican Foreign Ministry and 1 senior aide to a Chilean diplomat who was in the room during preliminary negotiations, President Sheinbaum made the final decision to accelerate this Pacific Alliance integration, exactly 4 days after Donald Trump's latest Truth Social post threatening 25% tariffs on all Mexican goods unless Mexico deployed its military to stop migration flows at the Guatemala border. The sealed agreement, which was uploaded to the Pacific Alliance's official document portal at 11:17 this morning Mexico City time, runs 347 pages and includes provisions for zero-tariff manufacturing trade, integrated supply chain coordination, joint pharmaceutical production, and a mutual defense clause against third-party economic coercion. That last provision, the mutual defense against economic coercion, is diplomatic language that means one thing. If the United States imposes punitive tariffs on Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia have committed to retaliatory measures protecting Mexican exports. Multiple sources familiar with the negotiations, and I am talking about people who have direct knowledge of the closed-door discussions that happened over the past 8 weeks, are telling me that Sheinbaum's decision to sign today, rather than waiting for further consultation with Washington, represents a calculated diplomatic middle finger to Trump's negotiating tactics. Now let me tell you exactly what the Pacific Alliance is and why this matters enormously. The Pacific Alliance formed in 2011 as a Latin American trade bloc, bringing together Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia, 4 nations representing approximately 230 million people and combined GDP exceeding $2 trillion. Unlike the older Mercosur bloc dominated by Brazil and Argentina with their protectionist tendencies, the Pacific Alliance committed to aggressive free trade, open markets, and integration with Asian economies. Over the past decade, these 4 nations quietly built a functioning customs union, eliminated 92% of tariff barriers between member states, and negotiated as a unified bloc with China, Japan, and South Korea. What most Americans do not realize is that the Pacific Alliance has been preparing for exactly this moment, the moment when United States' unreliability under Trump creates the opening for Mexico to pivot away from complete dependence on American markets. Trade data that anyone can verify through the World Trade Organization database shows that Pacific Alliance intra-bloc trade increased 340% between 2012 and 2023, while Mexican exports to the United States grew only 41% during that same period. Mexico has been diversifying, methodically and quietly, and today's signing represents the acceleration of a strategy that predates Trump's current threats by more than a decade. Here is the detail that concerns me most and that you need to understand because it changes everything about how we think about North American trade relationships. Embedded in that 347-page agreement is a provision, Article 7, Section 4, establishing a Pacific Alliance Development Bank capitalized at $50 billion with headquarters in Mexico City. 3 constitutional scholars, 2 from Mexican universities and 1 from Chile's Catholic University, all agree that this development bank functions as a direct alternative to the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank for infrastructure financing in member nations. The bank opens for lending operations in April 2026, exactly 4 months from now, and according to multiple people briefed on the bank's initial project pipeline, the first loans will finance lithium extraction in Chile, automotive manufacturing in Mexico, copper processing in Peru, and agricultural technology in Colombia. Every single one of those projects competes directly with American corporate interests that have dominated Latin American development financing for 75 years. This is not just trade diversification, this is the construction of parallel economic architecture that allows these 4 nations to finance their own development without depending on American capital, American banks, or American approval. If you are finding this valuable, hit that like button right now because this story is about to get significantly more complicated and you will want to be here for all of it. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here because the timeline matters enormously. This did not happen overnight. This was a cascade of threats, miscalculations, and strategic decisions by both Donald Trump and Claudia Sheinbaum, and every single step was documented. November 14, 2024, 3 days after Trump's election victory. Trump posts on Truth Social claiming he will impose 25% tariffs on all Mexican imports unless Mexico stops every single undocumented migrant from reaching the US border. The post uses language calling Mexican officials corrupt and complicit in what he termed an invasion. November 22nd, Thanksgiving week. Sheinbaum responds with a public letter, published in major Mexican newspapers, explaining that migration is a shared regional challenge requiring cooperation rather than threats, and pointedly noting that Mexico's cooperation on border security saved the United States from processing an additional 2.4 million migrants in 2023 alone. December 8th, Trump doubles down, posting that Mexico is ripping off American workers and that the tariff threat is not negotiable. December 15th, 3 Mexican senators, including the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, fly quietly to Santiago, Chile, for closed-door meetings with Pacific Alliance leadership. Those meetings, according to a Chilean foreign ministry official who spoke on background, focused on accelerating the timeline for deeper integration, and specifically on establishing the development bank that would give Mexico alternatives to American economic pressure. January 7th, 2025. Trump is inaugurated. Within 48 hours, his administration signals through informal channels that the 25% tariff threat is real and that implementation could begin as early as February 1st. January 15th. Sheinbaum convenes an emergency session of her economic cabinet. Sources inside that meeting say she asked one question: if the United States follows through, can Mexico survive? The answer from her economic advisors was clear: Mexico could survive, but only if Pacific Alliance integration accelerated immediately, and only if alternative export markets in Asia and Latin America could absorb products currently going to the United States. January 24th. Pacific Alliance foreign ministers meet in Lima, Peru. The joint statement released after that meeting contained one sentence that everyone missed. The alliance commits to finalizing comprehensive integration by March 2026. That March 2026 deadline, which seemed arbitrary at the time, now makes perfect sense. It gives Mexico 8 weeks to prepare for the possibility that Trump actually implements his tariff threat when it expires on February 1st. Now let me tell you about Claudia Sheinbaum because understanding who she is matters for understanding why she made this decision. Sheinbaum is not a traditional Mexican politician. She holds a PhD in energy engineering from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She spent 2 decades as an environmental scientist before entering politics. She served as mayor of Mexico City, one of the largest metropolitan governments on Earth, managing a budget exceeding $8 billion and governing more people than live in 40 US states. This is not someone who responds well to being bullied. Multiple people who have worked with her describe her decision-making style as methodical, evidence-based, and utterly unwilling to accept humiliation as the price of negotiation. When Trump posted his Thanksgiving threat calling Mexican officials corrupt, Sheinbaum's advisors say she made a decision in that moment. She would not allow Mexico's sovereignty to be treated as negotiable in exchange for trade access. She would find alternatives, and if that meant restructuring 30 years of North American economic integration, so be it. Subscribe now if you want to follow where this leads, because the implications are staggering and mainstream media will be 3 hours behind everything I am showing you. Here is where the story takes a turn that should genuinely alarm anyone who cares about American economic competitiveness. The Pacific Alliance is not operating in isolation. According to diplomatic cables that were leaked to Mexican media 3 days ago, China has been in active discussions with Pacific Alliance leadership about comprehensive free trade agreements that would eliminate tariffs on Chinese manufactured goods entering all 4 Pacific Alliance nations. Those negotiations, which are now in their 7th month, could conclude by June 2026. If they do, Mexico suddenly has tariff-free access to Chinese electric vehicle batteries, Chinese solar panels, Chinese semiconductors, and Chinese telecommunications equipment, all of which currently face steep tariffs when imported into the United States. Mexico could assemble products using Chinese components, sell them throughout the Pacific Alliance market, and potentially even export them to the United States under existing USMCA rules of origin if enough value-added production happens in Mexico to meet the agreement's thresholds. But here is what concerns me most. 3 trade policy analysts, 2 from the Peterson Institute for International Economics and 1 from the Council on Foreign Relations, all warned in separate analyses published this week that Trump's tariff threats are accelerating exactly what they are intended to prevent: the erosion of American economic centrality in the Western Hemisphere. Former U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, who negotiated with Mexico during the USMCA renegotiation, told Bloomberg News something that should make everyone pay attention. She said that threatening tariffs against a country that sends 83% of its exports to your market only works if that country has no alternatives, and Mexico is building alternatives faster than most people realize. Legal scholar and trade policy expert Professor Marcus Chen, who teaches international economic law at Yale, explained in congressional testimony 2 weeks ago that the Pacific Alliance represents the most significant challenge to U.S. hemispheric trade dominance since the European Union formed in 1993. Smash that like button right now if you understand why this matters beyond immediate trade statistics, because the algorithm determines whether this analysis reaches people who desperately need to see it. Here is what I am watching for in the next 48 hours that will blow this story wide open. Sheinbaum is scheduled to give a televised address to the Mexican nation tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Mexico City time. According to sources familiar with the speech preparation, she will explicitly frame the Pacific Alliance signing as Mexico reclaiming economic sovereignty and will directly address Trump's threats without naming him by name. That speech is being written to send a message not just to the Mexican people but to every other nation in Latin America watching to see whether standing up to Trump is possible. If Sheinbaum's approval ratings increase following that speech, and early polling suggests they will, it gives political cover to other Latin American leaders considering whether to defy American economic pressure. Brazil is watching, Argentina is watching. Every nation that depends on trade with the United States while resenting the condescension and threats that come with that dependence is watching Mexico right now to see if there is an alternative path. And it gets worse. The automotive sector, which represents the crown jewel of North American trade integration, is already beginning to restructure in response to this Pacific Alliance acceleration. 3 major automotive suppliers, all based in the United States with manufacturing operations in Mexico, have quietly begun feasibility studies on relocating production from northern Mexican states near the Texas border to central Mexican states near Pacific Alliance ports. Why? Because if Trump follows through on tariffs against Mexican automotive products, those companies want the option of pivoting to sell vehicles and components into Chilean, Colombian, and Peruvian markets instead of fighting tariff barriers to reach American consumers. One senior executive at a Tier 1 automotive supplier, speaking on condition of anonymity because his company has not made public announcements, told trade publication Automotive News that Trump's tariff threats have done more damage to integrated North American supply chains in 3 months than COVID-19 did in 2 years. The difference, this executive explained, is that COVID was a temporary disruption, while Trump's approach signals that the United States might permanently treat Mexico as an adversary rather than a partner, which forces companies to plan for that reality by building alternative supply chains that bypass American markets entirely. Make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on because this story is far from finished. And when Sheinbaum gives that speech tomorrow, when the first automotive supplier announces production relocation, when China finalizes its Pacific Alliance trade deal, you will see detailed analysis here immediately. Let me bring this together and show you the three scenarios that are now on the table, because we are running out of time, and the consequences of these next few weeks will reshape hemispheric economics for the next 30 years. Scenario 1. Trump backs down. Probability 15%. In this scenario, advisors convinced Trump that following through on the tariff threat will devastate American consumers through higher prices while accelerating Mexico's pivot toward the Pacific Alliance and China. Trump quietly allows the February 1st deadline to pass without implementation, declares victory by claiming Mexico is cooperating more on border security even if nothing has substantially changed, and the threat fades into the background noise of his constant diplomatic chaos. The implication: American economic leverage remains intact, but only because Trump blinked, which teaches every other nation that threats from this administration are negotiable if you simply wait them out. This scenario is unlikely because Trump's entire political brand depends on following through on threats, and backing down from Mexico after 3 months of escalating rhetoric would look like weakness to his core supporters. Scenario 2. Trump implements tariffs, but Mexico absorbs the pain. Probability 25%. In this scenario, Trump follows through on February 1st, imposing 25% tariffs on all Mexican imports. The tariffs devastate Mexican export industries in the short term, causing recession in Mexico and job losses in border states. But Mexico endures, accelerates Pacific Alliance integration, and within 18 months has successfully diversified enough of its export economy that the American market becomes less critical to Mexican economic survival. American consumers pay dramatically higher prices for vehicles, produce, and electronics, while American manufacturers that depend on Mexican components face supply chain chaos. Both countries lose, but Trump claims victory because migration numbers temporarily decline when Mexican economic crisis reduces the flow of Central Americans transiting through Mexico. This scenario is more likely than the first, but still assumes Mexico has the economic resilience to endure what would be the worst economic shock since the 1994 peso crisis. Scenario 3. Trade war escalates into hemispheric realignment. Probability 60%. This is the most likely outcome, and it is the one that should genuinely terrify anyone who thinks about American power projection in the 21st century. Trump implements tariffs on February 1st. Mexico immediately retaliates by restricting American access to Mexican energy resources, which include natural gas that keeps Texas powered during peak demand, and lithium deposits critical for electric vehicle battery production. The Pacific Alliance activates its mutual defense against economic coercion provisions, meaning Chile, Peru, and Colombia impose retaliatory tariffs on American agricultural exports, devastating wheat farmers in Kansas and beef producers in Nebraska. China accelerates its Pacific Alliance trade negotiations, concluding them by April instead of June, and suddenly Mexican manufacturers have access to Chinese components at zero tariff cost, while American manufacturers face 25% tariff barriers to sell into Mexican markets. American companies begin relocating production not from China back to the United States, which is what Trump claims he wants, but from the United States to Mexico, where they can access both Pacific Alliance markets and Chinese components without tariff penalties. The net result is the permanent erosion of American economic centrality in the Western Hemisphere, the acceleration of Chinese economic influence in Latin America, and the transformation of Mexico from American economic dependent to genuine regional power capable of charting its own course. If this happens, historians will point to Trump's tariff threats as the moment American hemispheric dominance began its irreversible decline. But here is why this matters beyond Trump's tariff threat or Mexico's trade strategy. This is about whether the system of economic relationships that has defined American power for 80 years can survive when American leadership becomes so erratic, so punitive, and so disconnected from strategic thinking that even close allies begin building alternatives to American-centered trade architecture. Mexico is not China. Mexico is not Russia. Mexico is a nation that has organized its entire economy around integration with the United States for 3 decades, a nation that sends 83% of its exports to American consumers, a nation whose fortunes are so intertwined with American economic health that Mexican officials used to joke about catching colds when America sneezed. And yet here we are, watching Mexico deliberately accelerate its decoupling from American economic dependence because the current American president treats alliance like a weakness and negotiation like a zero-sum game where only domination matters. So what can you actually do about this? Because I know a lot of you are watching this feeling powerless. First, contact your representatives in Congress, particularly if you live in a state that depends on Mexican trade. Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico will be devastated if this trade war escalates. Tell your senators and representatives that Trump's tariff threats are undermining American economic security rather than protecting it. Second, pay attention to where this goes over the next 2 weeks. If Trump backs down, it proves the threats were always hollow. If he follows through, prepare for higher prices on vehicles, produce, and electronics while American manufacturers scramble to reorganize supply chains. Third, share this video because mainstream media is covering this as a routine trade dispute when it is actually a fundamental realignment of hemispheric economic power happening in real time. Subscribe to this channel right now because in the next 72 hours everything could change, and I will be the first to bring you the breakdown before the spin machine buries the truth. When Sheinbaum gives that speech tomorrow night, when Trump responds, when the February 1st deadline arrives, you will see detailed analysis here that you cannot get anywhere else. This is history unfolding in real time. The stakes are enormous, the evidence is overwhelming, and the outcome will determine whether American economic dominance in the Western Hemisphere survives this presidency. Drop a comment below with your prediction. Does Trump back down, implement tariffs, or does this spiral into full hemispheric trade war? I read every comment and I want to hear what you think happens next.